There is something that most people never think about when they imagine surviving a brutal winter. They think about firewood. They think about wool blankets and the thickness of their walls, and how many cords they manage to split before the first hard freeze. They think about the stove in the middle of the room and whether it will hold all night. They run through their inventory of canned goods and dried beans and salt pork, and they calculate and they worry and they prepare in the ways that every almanac and every neighbor and every piece of received prairie wisdom has told them to prepare. And in doing all of that, they miss the one thing that matters most. They never think about the ground beneath their feet. They never think about what the earth itself can do when a human being is wise enough, or desperate enough, or grief-hollowed enough to ask it for help. This is the story of a woman who asked. The earth answered. And 16 people who would otherwise have died in the winter of 1887 lived instead warm and fed in a chamber below a forgotten woodshed on the northeastern plains of Dakota Territory, while the temperature above them held at 38 degrees below zero for 3 days without stopping. Her name was Sigrid Halverson. In the autumn of 1884, she was 31 years old alone and in possession of exactly 47 acres of unbroken prairie in the northeastern corner of Dakota Territory, roughly 11 miles southwest of the small settlement of Grafton. The land was good land. That was never the problem. The problem was that Sigrid had arrived at it through grief so recent and so total that it had not yet finished reshaping her. Her husband, Eric Halverson, had died of a ruptured appendix in the spring of 1883, 2 days after the pain began, and 1 day after it became clear that no doctor could reach them in time across the still thawing roads of early April. He was 34 years old. He had been by every account offered by the neighbors who later spoke of him with the particular reverence reserved for men who die before they finish becoming what they were meant to be, a capable man in the fullest sense of that word. Not remarkable, not extraordinary, but capable in the way that mattered on the northern plains in the 1880s. Which is to say that he knew how to work, and he worked without complaint, and the work he did was solid and lasting. He had built their house himself, a one-room sod structure with a wood plank floor and a single south-facing window that let in just enough light to read by on clear afternoons. He had dug the well by hand 31 feet down through Dakota clay and gravel until he found water that ran clean and cold year-round. He had broken 16 acres of sod in their first 2 seasons, turning that dense, root-bound northern grassland with a single bottom plow and a borrowed team acre by stubborn acre until the dark soil lay open and ready. He had plans for another 10 acres in the spring of 1883. The plans died with him, and Sigrid was left with all of it. The acres, the debt, the daughters, and the unfinished work that stretches out in front of a widow on the northern plains, like a road that does not curve and does not end. The daughters were Astrid, who had just turned 9 and already possessed a practical, watchful intelligence that reminded Sigrid sometimes of her own father, and Britta, who was 7 and felt everything at full volume, the cold and the fear and the loneliness and the small daily joys with equal and unfiltered intensity. They were healthy children. They were good company. They were also in the arithmetic of prairie survival, 2 more mouths to feed through a winter on a claim that had been margined for 2 working adults and had now lost the stronger of the 2. The debt was $62 owed to a dry goods merchant in Grafton named Carlyle, who had extended credit through the summer of 1884 with the patience of a man who has already begun calculating what a parcel of land might be worth when the person holding it fails to pay. Carlyle was not cruel. That was almost worse. He was simply precise and precision. In a creditor feels to a debtor indistinguishable from cruelty when the margin is thin and the winter is long. The neighbors, such as they were, on those scattered claims, did not expect Sigrid to stay. The nearest family was the Lundgrens, Carl and Anna, and their 4 children, who held the claim 1.5 miles to the east. Carl Lundgren was a large-framed, deliberate man who had come to Dakota from Wisconsin 3 years earlier and had built a solid frame house and a proper barn. and a life that looked from the outside like a man who had made good decisions and intended to keep making them. He came to Sigrid's door in the second week of September 1884, standing at the edge of her yard with his hat in both hands, in the posture of a man delivering a difficult truth he genuinely believes will be received as kindness. He told her she ought to take the girls and go back to Minnesota, where her sister lived. He said there was no shame in it. He said it the way a man says a thing he has already decided is correct, without cruelty, but also without the hesitation that leaves room for another person's judgment to enter the conversation. A woman alone with 2 young children, this far out with what was coming, he said. There was no shame in going. He had heard of another widow, 2 claims south and 3 east, who had tried to winter alone the previous year and had nearly lost the younger child to a fever she could not break because she could not maintain heat and tend the child simultaneously. Sigrid thanked him for his concern. She kept her voice level and her expression composed, and she did not explain anything because she had learned watching her father spend 40 years building things that other people did not immediately understand. That explanation offered before demonstration is almost always wasted breath. Carl Lundgren walked back to his claim with the satisfied bearing of a man who has done his civic duty. He believed she would be gone before November. He would remember that belief for the rest of his life, not with bitterness, but with the particular humility of a man who has been comprehensively wrong about something that turned out to matter. What Carl Lundgren did not know, and what none of the neighbors scattered across those flat miles of Pembina County knew, was that Sigrid Halverson was not simply a Norwegian-American widow with $62 of debt and a stubborn attachment to a claim that common sense suggested she should abandon. She was the daughter of Thorvald Nesheim, and that fact changed everything. Thorvald Nesheim had spent 40 years building things before he came to America in 1871. He had learned his trade as a young apprentice under a master builder in the central valleys of Norway, and what he was taught went considerably deeper than joinery and timber framing. His teacher was a man who had studied the old structures, the centuries-old storage houses and winter shelters built by craftsmen who had no access to imported timber or cast iron stoves or any of the other materials that the modern age offered as substitutes for genuine understanding. What those builders had understood and what had been preserved and passed forward through a narrow chain of men who took the work seriously enough to transmit it intact was a principle so fundamental and so consistently overlooked that it had effectively vanished from common practice by the time most people stopped needing it. The earth below the frost line maintains a temperature of between 40 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the air above it is doing. In a northern winter, that differential between the frozen surface and the living earth below it is not a curiosity or a footnote. It is the difference between dying and not dying. Thorvald had built deep earth shelters in his years before emigrating. Structures designed not merely to store root vegetables through the winter, but to sustain human life in conditions that would kill a person in any above-ground structure, regardless of how much firewood they had stacked. He had brought the knowledge across the Atlantic when he came to Minnesota, not because he knew precisely when or where it would be needed, but because a man who understands something real and durable does not leave it behind when he moves. Thorvald Nesheim died in the winter of 1881 outside St. Paul, Minnesota, at the age of 62. He was still strong enough at the end to be frustrated by the slowing of his body, and still clear-minded enough to know what he needed to pass forward before the passing became impossible. In the summer of 1880, the last summer Sigrid saw him alive, he had sat with her at the kitchen table of the farmhouse outside St. Paul and done something she had never seen him do in any other context. He had drawn. Thorvald Nesheim was a builder, not a draftsman. His hands were built for a hammer and a spade, not a pen. But what he put on that folded sheet of brown paper that afternoon was as precise as anything an engineer might produce, because it was the product of 40 years of building things that had to work in conditions that did not forgive him precision. He drew the cross-section of the underground shelter with measurements and material notes and small arrows indicating the direction of airflow through the ventilation shaft. He explained each element as he drew it, and Sigrid sat across from him and listened and asked questions until she understood not just what each piece was, but why it was that way and not some other way. Then he folded the paper into quarters and handed it to her and told her to keep it. She had not known, sitting at that table in the summer light of a Minnesota kitchen, that she was receiving the most important document of her life. She had kept it for 4 years, through the move to Dakota, through Eric's death, through 2 summers of working the claim alone. She knew every line of it from memory. She had never told anyone about it because the knowledge it represented was the kind that does not translate well into conversation and translates perfectly into demonstration. And she had not yet found the occasion for demonstration. The occasion arrived in the autumn of 1884, and she recognized it with the clarity of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing long enough to know it when it finally appears. In the first week of October 1884, Sigrid Halverson began to dig. She chose her location with the precision of someone who had been thinking about it since spring, turning the problem over in her mind through the long working days of planting and cultivating and harvesting, considering and rejecting possibilities, until only one remained that satisfied every constraint simultaneously. Not in front of the house where it would be visible from the road, not in the open yard where any passing neighbor would see disturbed earth and ask questions she was not ready to answer. She chose the woodshed, the simple lean-to structure built against the north wall of the sod house, 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, with a dirt floor and a roof of rough-cut planks covered in tar paper. It already held most of her winter wood supply, approximately 3.5 cords of cottonwood and green ash that she and the girls had stacked through September. It faced north. It was forgettable. It was exactly what she needed. She began by pulling the wood stacks away from the north corner of the shed, moving them with care, restacking them so that the outer profile of the wood pile would look unchanged to anyone who glanced in. Then she took the long-handled spade from the tool corner, positioned it at the exact point marked on her father's drawing, and drove it into the dirt floor of the woodshed. The topsoil in that part of Dakota Territory is a dark, dense loam that runs between 18 and 24 inches deep before giving way to a pale subsoil of clay and fine gravel. It holds together and resists being moved, which means the work of moving it is genuine and cumulative and does not get easier as it goes. She worked with the long-handled spade for initial breaking and a short-handled trenching shovel for detail work. And she moved the excavated earth in a wheelbarrow, load by load, out through the woodshed and around to the south wall of the sod house, where she packed it against the foundation in the posture of a woman banking her walls against the coming cold, which in one sense was exactly what she was doing. Astrid and Britta helped with the wheelbarrow in the afternoons, after their lessons, taking turns pushing the loaded barrow around the corner of the house and tipping it against the south wall. Sigrid told them they were helping her winterize the house, which was true. She did not tell them what the digging was for, not yet, because there was no point in explaining an outcome that had not yet materialized, and because she had watched her father keep his own counsel on works in progress until they could speak for themselves. She dug every morning from first light until the girls needed her for the midday meal, and again in the late afternoon until the light failed. Her lower back began to register its objections at the end of the 3rd day. By the 7th day, the objections had become a continuous low-frequency ache that she felt in her teeth when she turned over in her sleep. She noted this the way she noted the weather and the wood supply as a condition to be managed rather than a problem to be solved, and she kept digging. Her hands blistered and the blisters broke, and the skin beneath them hardened into the roughened, capable surface of hands that have decided to stop complaining and start adapting. The design she followed was the one Torvald Nesheim had drawn on the folded sheet of brown paper. The main chamber was to be 8 feet deep from surface grade, 10 feet long and 7 feet wide. The walls were to be cut vertically into the subsoil, not sloped or tapered, because vertical walls created a defined and stable space rather than a rough pit that would narrow and crumble over time. The ceiling was to be formed by laying 6-inch round timbers across the full width of the chamber at the required depth, then covering those timbers with a layer of loose straw 12 inches deep, then covering the straw with the excavated earth, tamped firmly to a depth of 18 inches. The floor was to be left as bare packed earth. No wood planking, no stone, no insulating material of any kind, because the entire purpose of the floor was to allow the thermal mass of the ground itself to radiate upward into the enclosed space, the way a hearth radiates from its center, steadily and without interruption, fed by the deep reserves of the earth, rather than by any fuel that had to be cut and carried and rationed. She reached the required depth of 8 feet on the 18th day of digging. She had moved in total a volume of earth that she calculated at roughly 4.5 tons a number, large enough to explain the condition of her back and her hands and her shoulders, and irrelevant now that it was done. What mattered was the chamber itself. The clean vertical walls and the level floor, and the specific dimensions that her father had specified, and that she had held to with the exactness of someone who understood that the tolerances were not arbitrary. The timber for the ceiling presented the most significant engineering challenge of the entire construction. There were no 6-inch round timbers available on the open prairie of northeastern Dakota Territory. The prairie does not produce them. What it does produce in the low ground along creek beds and river margins is cottonwood, and there was a stand of mature cottonwood trees along the small creek that ran through the eastern edge of the Lundgren claim. Carl Lundgren had told Sigrid in the spring that she was welcome to cut deadfall from that stand, as he had no use for it. She had thanked him without yet knowing how precisely she would use the permission. She cut 7 cottonwood poles on a cold morning in the second week of October, selecting each one for straightness and diameter, working with a pruning saw and a hand axe on trees that the previous winter had already brought down to the ground. Getting them back to her claim required a solution she had been developing since spring. She did not own a horse, and Eric had planned to buy one the spring he died, and the plan had died with him. What she had was Solveig the milk cow, a broad-shouldered phlegmatic animal who had spent the previous summer learning to pull a sled under Sigrid's patient instruction. Because Sigrid had understood from the first solo summer that there would be times when something heavy needed moving, and there would be no one to help her move it. Solveig had resisted the training for 2 weeks, and then accepted it with the pragmatism of an animal that has concluded that resistance requires more energy than compliance. 2 poles per trip, lashed to the sled with a harness leather, a round trip of approximately 3 miles across frozen ground. 4 trips over 2 days. Solveig made each trip without drama. She laid the 7 cottonwood poles across the width of the chamber on the 14th of October. Setting them into notches, she had cut into the subsoil walls at the precise depth the drawing specified, so that each pole rested with its full lower surface against the earth and could not shift or roll. She packed the gaps between the poles with strips of old burlap sacking soaked in water and set outside overnight to freeze solid, a technique her father had called frost mortar in his notes, which would hold through the winter and could be cleared in spring without damaging the timber. Over the poles, she laid the straw spread in an even layer across the full ceiling surface to a depth of 14 inches. Over the straw, she replaced the excavated earth shovel load by shovel load, tamping each layer with the flat back of her spade and the heel of her boot. 18 inches of tamped earth that settled over the insulating layer below it and became from above indistinguishable from the surrounding shed floor. When she was finished, the woodshed floor above the chamber sat approximately 8 inches higher than it had before. She spread a thick layer of wood chips over the disturbed area and restacked the winter's supply on top of it. The change was unnoticeable unless you were measuring, and no one who entered the woodshed had any reason to measure. The trapdoor was framed with 2 by 6 inch lumber she had purchased in Grafton, in August listed in the Carlisle Ledger as materials for repairing the house floor, which was partially true and entirely unremarkable. A widow with a deteriorating homestead buying floor lumber generated no comment and produced no memory in anyone. The door itself was cut from the same stock, two pieces face-nailed together, for thickness fitted with hinges made from harness leather, cut into strips. The pull handle was the length of the same leather, attached to a bent nail countersunk into the upper surface so that it lay flat when closed. When the door was shut and covered with its surface scattering of dirt and wood chips, it was invisible. It looked like shed floor. It felt like shed floor underfoot. Sigrid tested it 6 times over 2 evenings, opening and closing it and replacing the cover material, and then examining the result from the doorway with the critical eye of someone looking for what should not be there. On the second evening, she asked Astrid to walk across the woodshed floor. Astrid did so twice, picking her way between the stacked wood with the careful attention of a child who takes helpfulness seriously. And she crossed the hidden trapdoor both times without slowing her step or changing her expression, without any indication that the ground beneath her feet was anything other than what it appeared to be. That was the moment Sigrid understood the construction had fully succeeded. She stood in the woodshed doorway watching her daughter walk back toward her and felt something settle in her chest. Not pride exactly, because pride implies the resolution of doubt, and she had not genuinely doubted that the design would work. What she felt was closer to the particular quiet of a long preparation, completed the stillness that follows the last note of a piece of music that has been rehearsed until it could not fail. The ventilation shaft came next. She bored it on the 19th of October using a long-handled auger borrowed from Carl Lundgren on the stated grounds that she needed to bore drainage holes through the base of the water trough, which was true and which she completed first, before turning the auger to its other purpose. The shaft ran at 45 degrees from the ceiling of the chamber through the north wall of the woodshed, emerging outside at a point 6 inches above ground level. The exterior opening faced slightly downward and was partially shielded by the base of the woodshed wall from direct wind impact. Her father had explained the principle clearly. A shaft angled at 45 degrees with a slightly downward-facing exterior opening on the cold windward side of the structure would use the differential pressure created by passing wind to draw stale air out of the chamber rather than forcing cold air in. In still conditions, the natural tendency of warmer air inside the chamber to rise would create sufficient convective draft to maintain adequate ventilation without any wind assistance. She tested the principle with a lit candle held at the base of the shaft inside the chamber, and the flame bent steadily toward the shaft without flickering, drawn by a current of air. She could not feel on her hand, but that the flame registered without ambiguity. She held it there for a full minute, watching the consistent angle, and what moved through her in that moment was the recognition of her father's intelligence made physical, his understanding of an invisible principle now made visible by a small flame in a dark room beneath a woodshed on the Dakota prairie. She provisioned the chamber before sealing the trapdoor for the first time with the methodical care of someone who understands that the difference between a shelter and a death trap is preparation. 40 pounds of dried beans, 30 pounds of cornmeal, a 10-pound slab of salt pork wrapped in oilcloth, 12 quarts of preserved vegetables in sealed glass jars, a 5-gallon tin of lard, 2 wool blankets folded flat against the east wall, a complete change of heavy clothing for each of the 4 of them packed in a waxed canvas bag, a box of matches, 4 tallow candles, the small oil lantern with 2 full pints of lamp oil in a sealed tin, and at the bottom of the canvas bag, wrapped in a square of oilcloth and tied with waxed thread, the folded brown paper drawing, and beneath it Torvald Nesheim's last letter, written from St. Paul in the autumn of 1881, 3 months before he died. She told no one what she had built. Not Carl Lundgren, who had given her the cottonwood permission and the use of the auger. Not the merchant Carlyle when she went into Grafton in late October to pay down $14 of her debt and buy a second pair of wool stockings for Britta, whose feet ran cold. Not the Peterson family who had arrived from Wisconsin the previous spring and built a frame house 4 miles to the northeast with walls only 4 inches thick and a stove that their eldest son had admitted was not properly seated in its flue collar. She said nothing. because she understood with a clarity that had sharpened itself against years of watching people dismiss her father's work, that the surest way to undermine a useful thing is to introduce it as a theory. Theories invite argument. Demonstrated results invite only the question of why it took so long. She would wait. The winter would explain it better than she ever could. October moved into November, and the days shortened and the temperature dropped in the incremental preliminary way of a Dakota autumn. Sigrid continued the farm's routines with the conserving, calculating focus that the season required, monitoring the wood supply, checking the seams of the sod house against drafts, bringing extra bedding straw from the loft for Solveig's stall. She listened to the wind the way her father had taught her to listen to it, not for its sound, but for what the sound indicated about direction and duration, and the particular quality of cold it was carrying. The first sustained cold came in the third week of November. Temperatures dropping below zero and staying there through 3 days of clear, still weather that froze the creek bed solid and turned the breath of the livestock into small, sustained clouds that hung in the barn air. Sigrid checked the chamber on the second morning, descending through the trapdoor in the pre-dawn dark with a candle and the thermometer. The temperature at chest height in the center of the chamber read 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the mercury had not risen above -6 since the previous afternoon. She stood in the chamber for a moment with the candle in her hand, reading that number. Then she climbed back up, replaced the trapdoor cover, went to the house, and started the stove for breakfast. What the thermometer had told her was this: the earth was keeping its promise. The 44 degrees in that chamber was not accidental. It was the steady accumulated thermal mass of the ground itself, doing what it had always done, what it would continue to do regardless of whatever the atmosphere chose to inflict on the surface above it. The earth at depth does not panic. It does not deplete. It does not run out. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was cold, but not catastrophic. That distinction mattered enormously to the people who lived through it, because a winter that is merely cold allows for the illusion that preparation and willpower are sufficient, that a person who works hard enough and plans carefully enough can meet whatever the Dakota sky delivers. It was the kind of winter that confirmed existing beliefs rather than challenging them. And the existing belief in Pembina County was that a determined person with adequate firewood and a sound structure could survive anything the northern plains could produce. That belief would cost people dearly 2 years later. In the winter of 1884, it felt like wisdom. The first serious test came in the last week of December. 3 days of temperatures that dropped to 28 below zero, with a wind steady out of the northwest that drove the cold through every gap in every structure within a 50-mile radius. Sigrid monitored the sod house temperature through the first day of that cold spell, watching the mercury slide as the wind found the seams in the walls that had not been fully sealed, as the stove consumed wood at a rate that made her count remaining days and remaining cords simultaneously, as the south-facing window developed a skin of interior frost that thickened through the afternoon until the light coming through it was diffuse and gray. By the morning of the second day, she had made her calculation and her decision, and she executed it without drama. She told the girls to dress in their heaviest wool. She banked the stove with the largest piece of cottonwood she had, not to heat the house, but to buy enough time for the fire to burn down safely before she left it unattended. She tied the length of rope she had prepared weeks earlier from the house door handle to the woodshed door handle, a safety line across the 12 feet of open yard, because the wind was strong enough that disorientation was a real possibility, and 12 feet in a Dakota blizzard can become under the wrong conditions a distance a person does not complete. She led the girls across that gap in under a minute, one hand on the rope, one hand holding Britta's wrist. Astrid moving with the focused efficiency of a child who has decided this is a task requiring competence rather than feeling. In the woodshed, Sigrid lifted the trapdoor cover with one practiced motion, pulled the door open, and lowered the girls one at a time into the chamber below. Astrid descended first, and without hesitation, already understanding from the months of watching her mother work that this space existed and that existing was sufficient reason to trust it. Britta hesitated at the edge of the opening with a look that contained several distinct varieties of alarm, and none of the resignation that would have made it easier. "We are going to be warm," Sigrid told her, and the steadiness in her voice was not performance. It was the particular calm of someone standing on ground. They built themselves ground that they know the depth and the temperature, and the load-bearing capacity of because they put it there with their own hands. Britta descended. Sigrid followed, pulling the trapdoor closed above her and seating the wooden locking bar across its underside. She lit the lantern. The light it threw was orange and immediate, filling the chamber, completely touching every wall. The temperature at the moment they entered was 46 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than the October reading, because the sustained cold of December had drawn some stored warmth from the uppermost soil layers, but still 40 degrees warmer than the air outside and rising. The thermal mass of the deep earth was doing its slow stabilizing work, as indifferent to the howling above as the bedrock beneath it. Britta cried for the first portion of the first hour, not in panic, but in the sustained involuntary way of a child whose nervous system is processing a situation that exceeds her available categories. The underground was dark beyond the lantern's reach. The ceiling was low. The smell was the clean mineral smell of deep earth, unfamiliar and enclosing. Sigrid let her cry without trying to stop it, because stopping it would have cost something she preferred to spend elsewhere, and because she understood that what Britta needed was not to be told that everything was fine, but to discover through her own direct experience that the chamber was exactly what it appeared to be: a warm, quiet stable room beneath the ground, as indifferent to the howling above as the bedrock beneath it. The discovery took approximately 40 minutes, at which point Britta's tears stopped with the abruptness of a decision made. She wrapped herself in one of the wool blankets, lay down on the bare earth floor with her head on the folded canvas bag, and fell asleep. She slept for 11 hours. When she woke, the chamber temperature was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The lantern was still burning with a steady, unhurried flame, and the storm above them was audible only as a faint, muffled pressure against the ceiling, like the sound of a crowd heard from several rooms away, present but entirely unable to enter. Astrid spent those same 40 minutes reading by lantern light from the small book she had thought to bring, practical to the last. When her sister fell asleep, she closed the book and asked Sigrid one question. She asked whether the air would stay good, and Sigrid told her about the ventilation shaft, the angle and the physics of it, in terms as precise as she could make them without the drawing. And Astrid listened with the focused attention of a child storing information she intends to use, and then she nodded once and went back to her book. The storm lasted 3 days. They ate and slept and told each other the old stories that Thorvald Nesheim had told Sigrid when she was young. Stories about builders and winters, and the particular stubbornness required to construct something lasting in conditions designed to prevent permanence. The telling of those stories in that specific space produced in Sigrid a feeling she had not anticipated. The sense that her father was not absent from the chamber he had designed, but present in every wall of it, in every degree of warmth it held against the cold outside. When the storm broke, Sigrid climbed out to find the stove cold, the water bucket frozen, the window cracked in its lower corner from wind stress. She restarted the stove and melted water and put on a pot of beans, and the girls came up an hour later, warm and unhurried. And Britta came up carrying the blanket she had apparently decided was hers now, and Astrid went directly to the barn to check on Solveig without being asked. Within the radius of 6 miles surrounding the claim, every other homesteader had paid a significant price for those 3 days. The Lundgrens had lost 2 pigs and a calf, animals that had frozen in the night when the barn temperature dropped below what the structure could sustain. Einar Grondal, a Norwegian bachelor who held the claim 3 miles to the northwest and ran a modest sheep operation, had lost 7 of his 8 animals when a combination of insufficient bedding straw and a partial roof collapse created conditions his flock could not survive. The Peterson family had spent the final 3 weeks of winter living with the Lundgrens after their heating situation became untenable. The community's verdict on Sigrid's winter, delivered across several conversations through February and March, was that she had been lucky. Carl Lundgren said so to his wife, who mentioned it in passing to Anna Peterson, who repeated it to Sigrid in April in the gentle, informing tone that communities use when they have settled on an explanation and want you to know what it is. The winter had not been so bad, really. She had managed. It was good that she had managed. The general sense was that she was a capable woman in favorable circumstances, and that future winters would eventually demonstrate the limits of what a woman alone on 47 acres could sustain. Sigrid received this assessment with the same composed courtesy she had offered Carl Lundgren's September advice. She neither confirmed nor contradicted it. The assessment was not the kind that responds to argument. It responds only to evidence, and the evidence was still 2 years away. In the summer of 1885, she expanded the chamber. The decision was not driven by dissatisfaction, but by the recognition confirmed by the December trial that the design her father had drawn was a minimum viable structure, and that the margin between minimum and adequate narrows dangerously under conditions worse than what December 1884 had delivered. She dug the alcove through July and into early August, working in the cooler morning hours, excavating eastward from the main chamber's wall through a low arched opening that required an adult to duck slightly to pass through. The alcove ran 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, its floor covered in 6 inches of clean creek sand laid over the bare earth. Its ceiling supported by 3 shorter cottonwood poles fitted using the same notching method as the main chamber. She built a low wooden manger against the far wall and installed a second ventilation shaft mirroring the first. She cut a second, smaller trapdoor in the woodshed floor directly above the alcove entrance. The purpose of the alcove was warmth of a different kind than the earth provided. Torvald's notes had recorded that integrating small livestock into a below-ground shelter during extreme cold could raise the interior temperature by as much as 15 degrees above what the ground and human bodies alone could produce. Solveig was too large for the trapdoor, but the 3 hens were not, and they produced individually and collectively a sustained and reliable output of metabolic heat that cost nothing to operate, and that had the additional advantage of continuing to lay eggs at a reduced but non-zero rate even in the coldest months, provided they were kept warm enough to function. She built a hinged wooden crate for them, sized to pass through the trapdoor, fitted with a canvas top that could be tied closed for the descent. She tested the loading procedure twice with the actual hens, who expressed their views on the experience in the direct and unambiguous way of hens, and were back in the crate within 4 minutes on both occasions, indignant but uninjured. The thermal flywheel came last in the late summer of 1885, requiring the most material and the most physical labor of any addition she had made since the original excavation. Her father had described it in his notes with the slightly apologetic tone of a man introducing a term. He has invented, himself aware that the invention is unusual, but convinced that the term is accurate. A thermal flywheel was a mass of dense material positioned inside the chamber to absorb heat slowly from a temporary source and release it even more slowly into the surrounding space after the source was extinguished. Stone was the material he specified, dense sedimentary stone of the kind found in creek beds, where water and time have compressed material into forms that hold thermal energy most efficiently. She made 3 wagon trips to the creek bed on the Lundgren property across 2 weeks of late August, selecting stones in the 8 to 20 pound range for manageability and rejecting any that showed signs of fracture. She brought back 47 stones in total. She arranged them along the western wall of the main chamber in an interlocking stack 4 feet high and 3 feet deep, fitting each stone against its neighbors, with the care of a person building a structure intended to last, leaving 2 feet of working space between the face of the stone mass and the center of the chamber. The total weight of the thermal wall was somewhere near 600 pounds, and it represented in her father's understanding, and now in her own, the difference between a shelter that was adequate and one that was genuinely reliable. She tested it on a cold October morning in 1885. She lit the lantern and placed it directly against the base of the stone wall and left it burning for 2 full hours, then extinguished it. Climbed out, sealed the trapdoor, and went to do the morning's work. 12 hours later, she descended again with the thermometer. The reading at chest height was 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the temperature had fallen to 14 above zero since morning and was still dropping. She held the thermometer and looked at the number for a long moment. The stone wall was radiating stored heat into the chamber 12 hours after the heat source had been removed with no fuel, no tending, no maintenance required. In an emergency, a 2-hour investment of lamp oil could sustain a survivable temperature through a full day and night without any further action from anyone. The margin she had been building towards since the autumn of 1884 was now finally sufficient. She climbed back up, went to the house and started cooking supper. There was no one to tell. She did not need anyone to tell. What came in the autumn of 1886 was not a surprise to Sigrid, though it was a surprise to nearly everyone else. The summer had been wrong in ways that were difficult to name precisely, but that accumulated in her awareness through June and July and August. Like water rising behind a dam, each individual sign small enough to dismiss the collective weight impossible to ignore. The grass had been sparse and dry, and the cattle across the county were in visibly poor condition, thin through the flanks and moving slowly. The squirrels along the creek margins were catching with focused, almost frantic energy she had not observed in previous autumns. The muskrats that built their lodges in the slow reaches of the creek had constructed their autumn structures with walls noticeably thicker and foundations set noticeably deeper than the previous 2 seasons. The migratory birds that passed through Pembina County each autumn had departed 2 full weeks earlier than the previous year, moving through in a compressed, purposeful wave rather than the gradual drift of typical seasons. The ground froze hard in the first week of November, 3 weeks earlier than the year before. The first November snowfall left a crust that did not melt and did not soften. Sigrid began her preparations in the second week of November, working through each element of the chamber's readiness with the systematic attention she had given it every autumn, but with a deliberateness this year different in quality from the previous 2, more focused, carrying the specific gravity of a person who has assessed a situation honestly and has decided not to be caught short. She moved 30 additional pounds of dried provision into the chamber, stacking them against the east wall in a stable arrangement that left the floor space clear. She refilled the lamp oil container to its full 5-pint capacity. She inspected every joint in the ceiling timbers and found 2 sections of the frost mortar that had cracked over the summer heat, working the old material out carefully with a narrow chisel and packing fresh clay into the gaps, tamping it smooth with her thumb. She examined the ventilation shaft for blockage and found a compacted leaf mass 6 inches from the exterior opening that she cleared with a length of wire, verifying the draw afterward with a candle. She moved the hen's crate into the alcove permanently. She tested the trapdoor hardware and replaced the pull handle which had begun to show wear. She did all of this without telling anyone and without the feeling that she was keeping a secret. What she held was something different from a secret. Knowledge that was not yet ready to be useful to anyone else, that would become useful at the moment it was needed, and that could not be made useful by explanation in advance, because the people who needed it would not know they needed it until the moment arrived. The first serious storm of the 1886 season arrived on November 17th. 3 days' temperatures that never rose above 15 below zero, wind steady from the northwest at between 25 and 35 miles an hour. By the standards of what was coming, it was a preliminary, a threshold crossing rather than a true test. But it was sufficient to establish the pattern of the season and to begin demonstrating the gap between the structures that would hold and the ones that would not. Sigrid spent the first day in the sod house feeding the stove with the rationed care she had developed over 2 winters of learning exactly how much heat a given piece of wood would produce and exactly how long the house walls would hold that heat before it bled away into the frozen ground outside. By the morning of the second day, the house temperature at mid-morning was 38 degrees and her wood consumption was running at a rate she calculated would exhaust the above-ground supply in another 20 hours. She did not deliberate. Deliberation is for situations where the right answer is not already known. She dressed the girls in their heaviest wool, tied the guide rope to both door handles, and moved them across the gap to the woodshed in 55 seconds. She lowered them through the trapdoor, Astrid first, and without hesitation, Britta second, and this time without tears, and descended herself, pulling the trapdoor closed and seating the bar. The chamber temperature was 46 degrees. She lit the lantern and hung it from its nail in the ceiling timber, and settled her back against the stone wall with the wool blanket across her shoulders. Britta arranged herself with her head in Sigrid's lap without asking, which was its own kind of asking, and the kind Sigrid was always willing to answer. Within 2 hours, the lantern had raised the chamber temperature to 57 degrees. She extinguished it to conserve the oil. By the following morning, the temperature had settled at 50 degrees. She lit the lantern again for 2 hours. It climbed to 55 and held after she extinguished it. The storm lasted another 31 hours after that. They ate from the stored provisions. They slept. She told them again about Thorvald, and this time Astrid asked questions she had not asked before. Specific questions about the angle of the ventilation shaft and the reason for the stone wall, rather than brick or fired clay. And Sigrid answered each one completely, because Astrid was 12 years old, and the answers belonged to her. When the storm broke on the third day, Sigrid climbed out into the still cold aftermath and stood looking across the white buried claim. The sky had cleared to a hard pale blue. The temperature was 17 below zero and motionless. She went to the house, restarted the stove, put water on. The girls came up an hour later, warm and unhurried, and the world outside was altered by snow and silence, and none of them had lost anything to the storm that they could not replace. What none of them knew yet was that the storm of November 17th was the preface. The season had barely introduced itself. What was coming in January would not ask permission and would not offer warnings. And the difference between the people who survived it and the people who did not would be measured not in firewood or wall thickness, but in something that most of them had never thought to consider at all. January came the way catastrophe always comes on the northern plains, not with a single dramatic blow, but with a series of them, each arriving before the damage from the previous one had been assessed or repaired. The first week of 1887 brought 2 storms in 4 days, each lasting between 30 and 40 hours, with a gap between them of less than 2 days during which the temperature did not rise above -20 and the wind did not drop below 15 miles an hour. People used that gap to move livestock and haul water and take inventory of what they had left, but not to rest, because rest requires a kind of safety that the gap did not provide. It was a pause, not a reprieve. On January 9th, the season delivered what it had been building toward. The storm that arrived that evening was different in character from everything that had preceded it. The previous storms had been violent but mobile, moving through with the purposeful energy of weather that has somewhere else to be. This one settled. It positioned itself over the northeastern plains of Dakota Territory, like something that had made a decision and intended to hold to it. And it held the temperature at 38 below zero for 60 hours without meaningful interruption. The wind during the worst of that period was measured by the station agent at Grafton, a meticulous man named Hughes, who kept a daily journal of conditions and events at 47 miles an hour. He wrote the number in his journal that night and then wrote nothing else for the rest of the page, as though the number had exhausted the available language. Cottonwood trees split in the night with sounds like rifle shots, the moisture in their cores expanding as it froze until the wood could no longer contain the pressure. The ink in Sigrid's pen froze solid in its well on the shelf beside the stove inside the house, with the stove burning. She noted this and added another piece of wood to the fire and did her arithmetic again, and the arithmetic came out the same way it had the previous 3 times she had calculated it, which was badly. The north wall of the Lundgren woodshed failed at some point between midnight and 4 in the morning on January 9th. Carl Lundgren discovered it when he went out to feed the animals in the pre-dawn dark and found the wall buckled outward into the yard, driven by the accumulated snow load on the roof that had found the weakest point in the structure and pushed through it. The firewood stacked against that wall, most of it representing the better part of the family's remaining winter supply, was scattered across an area of open yard that the storm had covered to a depth of 3 feet before Carl got there and was continuing to cover as he stood looking at it. He spent 4 hours in that storm trying to recover what he could. He worked with the single-minded focus of a man who understands exactly what the alternative to recovering the wood looks like, moving through chest-deep drifts with a grain scoop, and his bare hands pulling split pieces from beneath the snow and throwing them toward the shed doorway. His wife Anna watched him from the house window for the first 2 hours and then stopped watching, because watching had become unbearable and was also useless. She was the one who finally went out and took hold of his arm and pulled him back inside, not gently, with the force of a woman who has looked at her husband's hands and seen the white patches spreading across the tips of his fingers and understood that the hands are more important than the wood. Both of his feet were showing the same white patches by the time he was inside, the color that precedes serious frostbite, in the way that certain silences precede certain conversations. Anna worked on his hands and feet for an hour, while the children sat on the far side of the room, watching their parents with the wide recording attention of children who are committing something to memory without knowing yet what they will do with it. By the morning of January 10th, the Lundgren family had approximately 6 hours of usable fuel remaining. The temperature outside was 31 below zero, and the storm showed no intention of relenting. 6 hours of fuel meant that by mid-afternoon, the house would begin its decline toward the temperature outside, and the temperature outside was the kind that killed a healthy adult in an unheated space within a few hours and killed children considerably faster. Carl Lundgren came to Sigrid's door at noon. He made the 1.5 miles on foot because the horse could not be asked to stand outside long enough to be harnessed and driven. And because walking was a problem, he understood how to solve, even if solving it cost him something he could not entirely afford to spend. He wrapped himself in a horse blanket over his coat and wound strips of burlap around his boots over the existing leather, and he walked into the wind for 45 minutes, the last 20 of which he could not feel his toes. He had passed the spot on the road 2 winters earlier, where he had stood with his hat in his hands and told Sigrid there was no shame in going back to Minnesota. He did not think about that as he walked. He was past the point where thinking about anything other than the next step was a luxury he could support. He knocked on the door, and Sigrid opened it, and the two of them looked at each other across the threshold for a moment, him with the frost on his beard, and the particular emptied look of a man who has used most of his available reserves getting to where he is standing, and her, with the composed steadiness that 2 winters of building and testing and waiting had produced in her, a readiness that had been so long in preparation that it had stopped feeling like readiness and had become simply her normal state. "I need help," he said 3 words. The stripped-down remainder after everything non-essential had been consumed by the cold and the walk and the arithmetic of 6 remaining hours. She told him to come in and get warm. She put coffee on the stove. She told him to go back and bring his family, all of them now, before the afternoon temperature dropped further. She told him to bring whatever food they had, and whatever blankets and whatever the children were wearing, and nothing else. Carl Lundgren looked at her across the table with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the expression of a man receiving charity, but something more complicated than that, containing relief and confusion in roughly equal measure. The look of a man who has arrived at a destination he did not know existed and is not yet sure what to make of the fact that someone else knew where it was all along. He drank the coffee. He stood carefully managing feet he could not fully feel and went back out into the storm. Sigrid had 2 hours and she used them completely. She descended into the chamber and lit the lantern against the stone wall for maximum heat transfer and left it burning while she worked above. She tested both ventilation shafts. She spread the second wool blanket on the floor of the main chamber and arranged the provisions against the east wall to create the maximum usable floor space. She moved the hens and their crate to the far corner of the alcove and spread fresh straw over the alcove floor. She unlocked and reseated the second trapdoor, testing its operation twice. She rigged a second guide rope from the woodshed door to the main trapdoor opening. When she climbed back down to check the chamber temperature, the lantern had been burning for 90 minutes against the stone wall, and the reading at chest height was 53 degrees. The thermal wall, which had been absorbing and releasing heat in its slow, patient cycle since October of 1884, was performing at the upper end of its range. She noted this without surprise because the wall had never failed to perform and went back up to wait. The Lundgren family arrived 2 hours after Carl had left her kitchen. Anna came through the woodshed door first, moving, with the compressed forward-leaning urgency of a woman who has been managing fear for 6 hours and has decided that urgency is the only acceptable expression of it. The 4 children came behind her. The youngest carried on Carl's back, all of them coated in the fine, dry snow that the wind drove horizontally at everything in its path. Sigrid directed them to the trapdoor without ceremony. Astrid helped the youngest Lundgren child down through the opening with a competence that suggested she had been rehearsing the role of assistant without being asked to. Britta stood at the edge of the opening and reached up for each descending child and steadied them on the ladder rungs with a steadiness that bore no resemblance to the child who had cried 40 minutes in the dark 3 years earlier. When Anna Lundgren stepped down through the trapdoor and straightened up in the chamber below, and the warmth of the space closed around her. After 3 hours of exposure to conditions that her body had been reading as a terminal situation, she stood without moving for nearly a full minute. The lantern was burning, the stone wall was radiating, the temperature in the chamber was 56 degrees and climbing. Anna stood in the middle of all of that with her eyes moving slowly around the walls, the ceiling timbers, the carefully arranged provisions, the ventilation shaft, the alcove with its crate of calm and untroubled hens, and her face went through several things in succession that did not have clean names. Then she turned to look at Sigrid, who had come down last and was pulling the trapdoor closed above them, and she asked the only question that the situation had left intact after stripping away everything else. "How long have you had this?" "Since October of 1884. Sigrid told her simply without emphasis, the way a person states a fact that has always been true and does not require amplification. Anna absorbed this. She absorbed the number 2.5 years and what it meant about the winter she had watched from her house window, assuming that Sigrid was managing on luck and stubbornness, and what it meant about Carl's verdict in the spring of 1885, that the winter had not been so bad and Sigrid had gotten through on favorable circumstances, and what it meant about the 45 minutes her husband had just spent walking into a 31 below wind with burlap on his boots because he had nowhere else to go. She absorbed all of it, and she did not say anything further because there was nothing further that the situation required. The chamber held 10 people through the following 72 hours. The lantern burned in shifts, 2 hours on and 4 hours off. The discipline of conservation running alongside the discipline of survival, with the steady interlocking rhythm of 2 systems built to work together. During the burning hours, the temperature climbed toward the upper 50s. During the dark hours, the stone wall held it above 48. At no point in those 3 days did the interior temperature approach anything that required additional management. The earth was doing what it had always been willing to do for anyone willing to go deep enough to ask. On the morning of the second day, the hens in the alcove laid 2 eggs. Astrid made the discovery during one of her methodical checks of the alcove space, which she had appointed herself to conduct every 4 hours, with the quiet authority of someone who has decided that a job exists and therefore someone should be doing it. She came back through the low arch into the main chamber, holding 1 egg in each hand, and the expression on her face was the compressed, controlled triumph of a person who has been proven right about something important and intends to let the proof speak for itself. The 2 eggs became a moment that none of the 10 people in that chamber ever forgot. Not because of the eggs themselves, which were divided into small portions and added to a pot of beans heated over the lantern flame, but because of what they represented in that specific context. evidence that ordinary life was continuing on its own terms, below the surface of the catastrophe, indifferent to what the atmosphere above was doing, as reliable in its small way as the stone wall in its larger one. The hens did not know there was a blizzard. They knew only that they were warm enough, and warmth was sufficient. On January 12th, the temperature outside rose to 8 below zero, and the wind dropped to under 15 miles an hour. Not safe for extended exposure, but survivable for a person dressed appropriately and moving with purpose. Einar Grondal arrived that afternoon on a horse he had kept alive through the worst of the storm by bringing it into his kitchen, a fact he mentioned without apparent awareness of its remarkableness, in the tone of a man describing a practical problem and its practical solution. He had heard through whatever mechanism of frontier communication operates, across even the most impossible conditions, that there was warmth at the Halverson place. He tied the horse to the woodshed post and let himself in through the woodshed door, and found the trap door which Sigrid had stopped concealing once the emergency made concealment irrelevant, and descended. He sat on the chamber floor for 3 hours thawing, eating a portion of beans, saying almost nothing. The single remark he offered, delivered to the room rather than to any particular person, was that the chamber was warmer than any house he had slept in that winter. He said it without wonder, which was itself a form of wonder, the flat, exhausted acknowledgement of a man who has stopped having the energy to be surprised and is simply receiving what is offered. The Peterson family arrived the following morning, having spent the worst of the storm at the Lundgren house, which was now cold and barely rain-habitable, and needing somewhere that was neither of those things. The Solberg family arrived from 2 miles south the same afternoon, and with them came the detail that became, in all the years of retelling, that followed, one of the fixed points of the story. Mrs. Solberg came through the woodshed door with a small pig under her arm, a young female of perhaps 30 pounds, and her explanation was delivered before anyone could raise an objection, and with the finality of a woman who has already conducted the relevant analysis and arrived at a conclusion that is not open for revision. "This pig does not survive the night in that barn," she said. "I am not leaving her." She was correct on both counts. The elderly Brastad couple arrived 2 days later, having spent the interval of relative calm attempting to sustain themselves in their claim house, a solid enough structure for ordinary winters, but maintained now by 2 people in their 70s who were running out of the physical capacity to keep it functioning. They came with a careful, upright dignity that made the asking harder to watch than any breakdown would have been. Sigrid received them without comment on the difficulty of their arrival, because commenting would have added to it. At its peak, the chamber and the alcove together sheltered 16 people. Also a dog of ambiguous breed belonging to the Solberg children, 4 hens and the pig, which turned out to have a calm, incurious temperament that made her a less disruptive occupant than several of the humans. The metabolic heat output of that population, combined with the lantern cycles and the continuous radiation of the stone wall, maintained the chamber temperature between 52 and 61 degrees across the worst days of January 1887. The ventilation held without adjustment. The ceiling timbers held without creaking. The frost mortar Sigrid had repacked with fresh clay in November held at every joint. The provisions held because Sigrid rationed them with the arithmetic she had been developing since the first winter, calculating portions against likely duration, with a precision that left everyone adequately fed, without depleting the reserve below the margin she had decided was non-negotiable. People accepted this rationing without argument, because the alternative to accepting it was visible to everyone, and no one wanted to look at it directly. Carl Lundgren spent the second day of his time in the chamber, sitting against the east wall, studying it with the focused technical attention of a man who builds things and recognizes a building problem that has been solved elegantly. He examined the ceiling joint where the cottonwood pole met the notched subsoil wall. He studied the angle of the ventilation shaft where it penetrated the chamber ceiling. He watched the way the lantern flame behaved during a burning cycle, reading the air movement in the small variations of the flame's height. He did not ask questions, not being a man who asks questions when observation can answer them. On the third day, his voice carried across the chamber to where Sigrid was sitting. "I'm going to build one of these before next autumn." It was not a question, and it was not gratitude, and it was not apology, though it contained elements of all three. It was the statement of a man who has encountered something he cannot argue with and has decided finally to stop trying. On January 15th, the last of the major storms of the season broke, and the temperature rose to 5 below zero and stayed there, which was, by the standards of the previous week, a form of mercy. People emerged from the chamber in groups of 2 and 3, blinking in the gray winter light, moving with the careful deliberateness of people whose legs have been mostly still for days. They went to their respective situations, the Lundgrens to assess what the collapsed shed wall had cost them, the Petersons to theirs, the Solbergs and the Brastads to arrangements that would require renegotiation of what was possible on their individual claims. Einar Grondal retrieved his horse from the post where it had stood each night brought inside to survive and rode back to his claim across the white and altered landscape with the same absence of commentary that had characterized his arrival. The story of what Sigrid Halverson had built under her woodshed moved through Pembina County in the weeks that followed with the particular speed and precision that genuinely useful knowledge acquires after people have recently been frightened badly enough to understand what they were missing. It did not travel as gossip, which softens and distorts as it moves. It traveled as technical information specific and repeatable, the dimensions and the materials and the ventilation principle and the thermal wall. Because the people who had spent days in the chamber had understood that they were inside a solution to a problem they had not known how to solve, and they wanted to be able to build it themselves. Carl Lundgren described the chamber to a group of men at the Grafton feed store in March of 1887 with the precise, admiring vocabulary of someone who has studied a thing closely enough to understand why each choice was the right choice. He said it was the most practical piece of construction he had encountered in his life on the plains, and that a woman had built it alone with borrowed tools and a design drawn on brown paper by a father she had not seen in 7 years. And that the men of Pembina County owed it to themselves and their families to understand how it worked and to build their own before the following winter. Several of them did. Carl himself began excavating in late April, hiring Sigrid to consult on the design and paying her $40 for 2 days of her time, which he applied directly to the remaining balance of her debt to Carlisle. Hughes, the station agent, wrote his account of the chamber in his journal on February 22nd, 4 paragraphs in the careful, measured prose of a man accustomed to recording weather data and who applied the same standard of precision to human events. He noted that the structure had provided warmth and safety for no fewer than 16 persons during the extreme conditions of January last, that it had been designed and constructed by a widow of 34 years of age, operating entirely alone and without assistance, and that it had performed without failure across 2 full winters before the emergency that demonstrated its full capacity. He noted in his final sentence on the subject that the degree of difficulty involved in the construction had apparently attracted no particular recognition from the community at the time it was undertaken. A fact he recorded without editorial comment, which was itself a form of editorial comment. That journal survived. It is held today in the collections of the State Historical Society of North Dakota, catalogued under the general heading of Frontier Homesteader Accounts, in a box that also contains a seed catalog from 1889, a child's drawing of a horse and 3 letters in an old language that have not yet been translated. The journal is the only document in the box that has been cited in published historical work. Sigrid paid the remaining balance of her debt to Carlisle in October of 1887. The last $48 arriving in 2 portions, the consulting payment from Carl Lundgren and the proceeds from the sale of 2 car fares she had raised from Solveig through the summer. Carlisle received the payment with the neutral professionalism of a man who has had the calculation he was running interrupted by an outcome he did not project, and who has the grace not to mention the calculation. He gave her a receipt and shook her hand. She drove the 11 miles home in the early October cold, with the claim free of the number that had been sitting against it for 3 years, free of Carlyle's patient arithmetic, free in the specific and irreplaceable way of a thing that belongs to the person who built it and to no one else. She worked the claim for the next 22 years. She broke the additional 10 acres that Eric had planned to break in the spring. He died, and then 10 acres more. And she bought a horse in 1889, a gray mare she named Nothing, because the horse did not appear to require a name, and neither did the relationship. She updated the chamber twice, replacing the ceiling timbers in 1891, when the original cottonwood poles began to show the softening that precedes structural failure, and expanding the thermal wall in 1895 with an additional 12 stones. Astrid learned everything. This happened gradually and without a formal transfer, the way knowledge moves between people who live and work in close proximity over years, through demonstration and observation, and the slow accumulation of practice, until the distinction between teacher and student dissolves into simple competence shared between two people who both possess it. By the time Astrid was 16, she could assess a chamber site, calculate the required excavation, specify the timber needs, and explain the ventilation physics to someone who had never encountered the concept. Before her marriage in 1897, she taught the construction method to 2 other women in the county, women whose circumstances suggested they might eventually need it, teaching the way Sigrid had always taught, through the logic of each element rather than the authority of tradition. Britta became a school teacher in the town of Park River. She taught there for 31 years, and she was by the accounts of people who passed through her classroom. During those decades, a teacher who understood that the most important things a child can learn are not the ones that appear in the curriculum. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography and history with the competence of a woman who had mastered those subjects herself. But what her students remembered, in the way that students remember the things that changed the way they understood the world, were the stories she told on the coldest January days, when the schoolroom windows were thick with frost and the stove in the corner was working at capacity, and the children were pressed as close to it as the seating arrangements allowed. She told them about the winter of 1887 and the 16 people and the temperature that held for 3 days while the thermometer outside registered 38 below zero. She told them about the eggs and about the pig, and about the old couple who arrived with their careful dignity and their exhausted pride and their need for warmth they could not produce alone. She told them about her mother and her grandfather's brown paper drawing, and the 47 stones in the thermal wall, and the ventilation shaft that drew air through a 45-degree angle, using a principle of physics that the men who first applied it had understood centuries before. It had a formal name. She always ended the story the same way, not with the numbers, which were impressive, and not with the engineering, which was elegant, but with a single image that she said had stayed with her for 60 years, with the clarity and the weight of something witnessed rather than learned. The image of an oil lantern burning steadily in an 8-foot chamber beneath a forgotten woodshed on the northern plains, surrounded by 16 people who had nowhere else to go, the flame burning without a tremor, without a flicker, without any of the small instabilities that mark a fire fighting against conditions that want to extinguish it. Because the conditions could not reach it. Because the earth between the flame and the storm was 8 feet deep and older than any winter this ground had ever experienced, and had held its temperature through every season that had ever come, and would hold it through every season that was still coming, and had no opinion about whether the people above it deserved its help, only the simple patient willingness to provide it to anyone who understood where to look. The earth, if you are willing to go deep enough, does not shake, and a woman who knows that and who builds accordingly does not need permission from the cold.